What's up, guys, and welcome back to another episode here on the Archi-Tech Network. Today, we're going to be joined by Dimitar Pouchnikov, and we're going to be talking about all things Blender. So, if you haven't come across him before, Dimitar has been teaching a lot recently about Blender and how architects can start to use Blender. He is an architect, and he comes from a background where he was actually using it in practices like HOK. He went on to start his own studio called Studio, where he teaches but also designs around Blender and other tools. And so I thought it'd be really great to get him on right now, because we're in this era where there are these kind of new kids on the block, the Houdinis and Blender, Unity, and all these other kind of things. And out of the new modeling platforms, I found Blender stood out to be the most to have the most potential to help us as architects in practice. It's open source. It seems incredibly powerful with its geometry nodes, and I see it popping up more and more. And I've even used it here and there in my own workflows in the office and in my own time. So I thought it'd be really good to get him in and understand a little bit more about Blender and how we can use it as architects. As always, if you like this video, please just give us a like and give us a subscribe. Mention us to your colleagues and friends. That's the whole point of doing these podcasts, is to share knowledge around architecture and technology. And as always, give us a like and a subscribe on Instagram or here on YouTube. But without any further ado, let's jump in and have a talk with Dimitar. All right, we are now live. Dimitar, thank you very much for coming to join the podcast. I'm excited to have you on today and chat all things Blender. So thank you very much for joining.
My pleasure. Nice to be here. Nice to see you again.
As always. So I always do a little bit of an introduction to guests, just for the audience that may not know you yet, or to add on to the introduction I gave you. But so a little bit of my bullet points from what I've found out about you. So you're a Bulgarian architect, right?
Well, I was born in Bulgaria, but I'm actually a US architect.
Oh, wow. Oh, yeah. So you're American and Bulgarian architect. That's pretty cool.
Hopefully very soon British as well.
Yeah. Yes, right. Ooh, we should touch on that, right? You're the founder of Studio and Design Academy, which is pretty interesting. The mix of like a design firm and then the teaching side, which we'll get to. And you've worked for a number of years in practice for HOK, AHMM, and AJ architects. And you're also kind of, one of the reasons why I was excited to have you on was you've really started to develop an interest in Blender and teach online. You've got, a really interesting YouTube channel that seems to be growing a lot. And I see you teaching all the time. So you're teaching for Futurely, Parametric Architecture, and Dezact. So I thought it was a really cool time right now to get you on and have a chat about Blender and all things Blender, really, as well as other things that we might touch on. So, I don't know if there's anything I missed there or you want to add on to it, but that's my little micro introduction for everyone.
That's pretty much it. I think I'm known as the Blender guy or the Blender architect.
Blendcatect. Is that a thing?
Blendcatect.
I like it. So let's maybe start on that. So, we could talk a little bit about your background, but let's jump into. So you've worked for a number of years as an architect. You have a good amount of experience, and you've been kind of working in practice as well and teaching along the way. When did Blender come into things? Like, when did you come across Blender? What attracted to it? And was it kind of whilst working in practice, or your own design? Where along your journey did Blender kind of come into the mix?
Well, it's hard to think of a time when I hadn't used Blender professionally, because I've used it since my undergraduate degree. And I started in my thesis year. I think even before that, I remember I had an internship back then when I told the guys that, listen, I can help you and I can do all this in Blender. Of course I couldn't. And you know how it is. You say you can do something, you can't. You spend a few all-nighters or a lot more than that learning it. And then you sort of like really force yourself to pick it up. And since then, I've been using it everywhere. At the AA, at DRL, there was a bit of a pause because there's so much more to take on board where we learn, Maya processing. I mean, those are the two big ones, really. And but then at some point near the end, I realized that what we're being taught in Maya could actually be made in Blender. So then I switched completely to Blender. My teammates weren't very happy about it, but we figured out that it's actually fairly good to work together because it's basically a mesh format. It works in the exact same way. And since then, this was 10 years ago, I've used Blender in every office, and typically nobody really says you can't use a free program unless you're doing something really
Yeah,
wrong. Everybody's actually quite happy to have somebody that can bring something new to the office.
that's a
So,
great that's a great point. The fact that it's free and accessible is such a pro to it.
yes, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the key advantages. Of course, it has to be great on top of being free because there are many free things, but they're not so great, right? And people don't really care whether things are free or not. They care about the functionality. But if you look at the grand scheme of things, and if you start doing a little bit of maths, especially in regards to office costs and so on, then you realize things really add up. For
Yeah,
example, with Maya, it's not included in the AEC suite
right.
and for the Autodesk AEC suite. So any company that decides to use Maya, that's a huge additional cost for the office.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great point. I talk about all the time. It's one that you don't see as many people talking about because they don't necessarily have to deal with that, right? Like the how much do these things cost, especially within an office. But it's interesting you touched on like it sounded like it kind of emerged from being at the AA where you're kind of playing around in Maya. Some people do see Blender as a Maya alternatives, on alternative, and I get the sense the purist Maya people will like see it as a little bit of a little brother to Maya. But I think what's interesting, what attracts me more to Blender than Maya, for example, is it just seems like it could do a lot of other things as well. Whereas Maya, I've always seen as like basically Zaha stuff. I never see anyone using Maya that doesn't look exactly like Zaha. Whereas Blender, I feel there's so many more dynamic sides to it, like the nodes and blocks and all these different kind of plugins that you can add to it. Blender BIM, which we'll maybe touch on a little bit, but it seems like has much more functionality and potential than Maya, for example.
It's a bit more broad, indeed. It's not good at everything that it does, but it is getting really better. And let's be super frank here, right? So Blender, Maya, 3ds Max, Cinema 4D, Modo, I don't know what else is out there these days that's not getting bought up and shut
We could
down by
keep going.
Autodesk, but all these are DCC apps that they do general modeling. Many others do animation and less do a few other things. But they're all basically the same. They're mesh modeling programs with pretty developed tool sets, and you can say that they're interchangeable if you know how to work with mesh topology in one. As long as you learn the user interface of another, you can pretty much do everything else. So that's the base, that's the starting point. So in that respect, yes, Maya and Blender are quite similar. But what Blender does offer on top of that is a few things. One is it has modifiers, which are a really easy way to become non-destructive without going into nodes and everything. So for some examples are mirror, array, radio array, some deformations, shrink wraps, all those things are just a modifier away. Booleans, that's another one. So back to your initial point where you were saying that Blender does offer a little bit more than Maya. Yep, I definitely agree with that because Maya does have subdiv modeling, but so does every other program. And when you refer to let's say Zaha Hadid architecture, that's what we see. Topologically, it's subdivision modeling based on loops, right? So you
Yeah.
create some loops, you have a base mesh, and then you insert a few more loop codes to get the really sort of beautiful ribbed patterns that we see in many of the typical Zaha architecture designs. So on top of modifiers, then we do have geometry nodes, which is a fairly new thing, and it's probably a bit more like Houdini, even though I don't use Houdini, than Grasshopper, and I'm a strong Grasshopper user, so that took a little bit of adjustment, but it's quite different. And I do have a few videos on my channel. I'm probably going to do a few more that compare the two and how one is more useful or less useful,
Yeah.
performance wise and so on. And on top of that, then there's Tissue, which is a tessellation add-on developed by a computational designer, Alessandro Zamparelli, who's also has an architecture background. And that's kind of what people tend to do in Grasshopper, right? The typical Zaha workflow, and I can speak about it even though I haven't worked in the office because I do come from DRL, which is, as you may know and the audience
It's
may
like
know, the
Zaha
the
boot camp.
exactly, it's the boot camp to get into Zaha, and it's co-founded by Patrick Schumacher. So in that sense, typically, you develop a pretty rough model, but the moment you wish to add some more detail, some people can do it. But many people import their rough massing and then they start to add more detail into Grasshopper. The problem is if you suddenly decide that you need to change something into the massing, you have to go and sort of interpolate the whole process again. So in Blender, you don't get a complete building output, although you can with Blender BIM, but you can get a little bit further in regards to the development of concept architecture than you would in Maya.
Right. That's interesting. So how does it fit into your like what is your workflow now for developing a project in your own studio? Are you developing it purely in Blender, or are you moving from Rhino, Grasshopper, Blender, and back and forth? Let's just talk just for the modeling, of course, visualization and these other things. You maybe using different plugins, but from a design and modeling perspective, what's your workflow right now?
It's pretty much all Blender, to be honest. I've gotten so used to it that I touch Rhino only in two cases, three cases, let's say. One is floor plans. You can't get away from having a proper CAD environment for floor plans. And many times it's much quicker to work something out in a floor plan than it is in try to solve it in three-dimensionally. The second is imports, right? So not that many architects work with Blender, a lot more, especially with the kinds of people I collaborate with, work in Rhino. So there's a lot of interoperability in there. And the third is detailing and documentation. So at some point, even though I'm designing in Blender, I can output excellent views, renders, and so on. But in case we need to develop that a little bit further, then I would bring that back into Rhino.
Right. That's interesting. Yeah. Yeah. And I think, to go back to kind of why I was most interested to get you on is that I think we are in this era where we have these kind of typical tools, Rhino, Grasshopper is a staple, Revit and all these kind of things. But then there's what I'm calling like the next gen that I see on the horizon of modeling platforms, and Blender is in there, Houdini. Maya is kind of like it's nothing new, but there's like a resurgence of it a little bit. I'm trying to think of other ones, but all of them I tend to find they're super interesting and super powerful. Like Houdini is a good example. I do see people using it, but as soon as no one is really using it in practice yet, and it just seems like um, it's either not quite there in terms of like delivering what we need as architects. The architects I see using it are using it for other things that have kind of got one foot in the architecture world, like maybe more metaverse space, or they've kind of gone down the VFX animation route. And out of all of these new gen things, and then you've also got the Unreals and Unity in that mix, which is slightly different. But out of all of them, Houdini, Maya, Blender seem to me that interest me the most, and I think I could see, this has some real potential. Of course, it's free, it's open source as well, which is really interesting. And I don't know if this is true, but it seems as though, because it is open source, the recent development of Blender is really taking off. Like, all the time I see someone pop up and there's a new aspect of Blender. Recently, Blender BIM has been kind of generating a bit of hype, and I even went down a rabbit hole. I just wanted like some a topographical surface from Google, and I found a video, and I ended up in Blender. So it's there seems to be a bit of a growing height curve recently of Blender being more used on a day-to-day basis in practice. But I don't know, since you've been using it for a while, is that kind of true? That, do you feel like, because is it to do with open source, or is it just that people are hearing about it and latching it onto it more?
I think it's a little bit of both, right? So Blender has been around since the mid 90s. It used to be a private in-house software for a Dutch animation studio, and they realized they have a good software in their hands, so they raised some capital, and they thought they wanted to make commercial product out of it. At some point, the founder of that animation studio realized that the commercial aspect is not going too well. He bought back the code. He crowdsourced it. This was back in 2000, where crowdfunding wasn't really a big thing yet.
Yeah.
And he opened the source code. And that's the founder of Blender, actually. And since then, the user interface every 10 years or so changes quite a bit in a good way. And the last big upgrade, I can't remember now if it was 2018 or 2019, was Blender 2.8, where the interface really changed in a major way. And that made it easier to use for a lot more people. And since then, it has indeed been growing exponentially in all kinds of different uses. For example, outside of architecture, for VFX, for movies, game studios. Outside of the US, it's used a lot. For example, there's some French studios, some Indian studios, a lot of Bollywood VFX is done with Blender.
Oh, wow.
But back to architecture, I so it's just inevitable if you're quite good at a software and you end up having a team that you're responsible for, and you decided, okay, this is the best thing to use for the job, that I start teaching some colleagues. So I've taught a lot of colleagues in the process, younger colleagues. And it was a little bit more difficult initially, but after that 2.8 version, my colleagues were quite receptive to it. They didn't feel like they were forced to learn something that had no use, but they thought, okay, this is actually something that I can definitely use for a lot of different architectural uses. So it's growing in that sense. In regards to user, people hear a lot more about it as well. And also, the Blender Fund has done an amazing job. So in regards to development, it's exponentially growing as well. I think the Blender Fund gets donations that equal to about 180,000 euros per month at the moment, and they have everybody donating. Nvidia, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, Google. They had an Unreal Epic grant a few years back. Unity, some gaming studios, a lot of smaller sponsors as well. So they get quite a bit of money and also some developer time. For example, there's a few guys from Apple, so Apple engineers, developers, that work on the Blender code to make sure that it works really well with the new M1 and M2 MacBooks.
That's interesting.
So they have an NVIDIA guy that does the same, So it's kind of like flipping the industry, the other way around. Instead of the architects or the users, the end users, paying a software company with a very specific expertise, it's actually these big tech companies that are paying the company to develop and even contributing with developer time, and
Yeah.
then everybody gets to utilize that.
So yeah, I think this that's a really great point, and it's not just Blender, right? As you brought up, Unreal have this Unreal grant. Unity, I think, also have one, right? Some kind of like they actually pay you to develop the product and things in to develop a game and that with that game engine.
Yeah,
And this is all trickling down into architecture because we're not a big. Well, I guess the construction industry is a big money industry, but architecture itself is not so much. And the tools that we have are clearly not developing at the same speed that we need them to. And so we're in
yeah,
this era also, which also ties in with this my next gen title of game engines coming into our industry. And, we're now adopting, I'm personally very excited about Unreal 5 as well as Blender. I mean, Unity and all these things are coming over from the game engine, and it's a completely different business model. For sure, I see game engines uh, playing a huge role in the future of like design technology in our industry. But do you think things like Blender and Unreal and all this kind of stuff, it might actually open up new opportunities for architects because now we have the same kind of skill set as sort of game engine developers or people that might create the environments in games. Of course, we can drop the buzzword of the metaverse and all this kind of stuff. So there's also something quite interesting about architects getting into these spaces, whether it be Blender, Unreal, Unity. When you're in that kind of environment and you're designing and creating in that environment, you can really go anywhere with it, right? You can deliver a building and let's say somehow transfer it to Revit and deliver the building. You can send it to another game engine and you can visualize it. For example, you can send it to a metaverse. You can sell it to a game, like a game developer. I think there's also something about these tools. Do you feel like will open up new opportunities for architects to venture beyond the world of bricks and mortar through the software that we use to design it?
um, definitely. So architecture has in some ways always been a good breeding ground for creative thinkers, and that a lot of those creative thinkers continue on to architecture practice, and some of them continue on to other fields, right? But that kind of design education that we have is fundamental to being creative in many different fields. And having free tools or easily accessible tools that allow us to put those ideas into some kind of form, perhaps not a built form, but some sort of digital form, is definitely a way to sort of develop skills a little bit better. I think from my research so far, like a lot of the metaverses, what shall we call them? They're all like based on Unity at the moment because the phone hardware is a challenge.
Right.
But I'm not too well versed in it. And if you go inside of them, they look pretty basic at the moment, right? The graphics are not great, but I did just doing some research, stumbled upon actually your company's a big pavilion. I forget for which company it was, but it's some unrealized building that is in the metaverse. And I thought, wow,
Right.
this is actually pretty interesting architecture to see. And you can experience it either on your computer or with a VR set or on your mobile. And so from that sense, there's going to be a lot more development, I believe, both in digital architecture, but also on the experiential point of view from the client side. So I'm really excited about VR and to a lesser extent the metaverse in places like Unreal or the NVIDIA Omniverse, where you can put together your whole project. And we know architecture projects these days, they can get a little complicated, a
Yeah.
lot, right? Not a little. And having a real-time perspective of what all that starts to look like from eye level, from the entrance or from like some experience is fantastic. I
Yeah.
use VR all the time with my private clients, and it's a game changer. They sit and now when they look around and they can see how their space is going to be. So I think that the metaverse is a lot about experience, perhaps even more so than some of the Instagram architecture that we see these days, which is really meant to be absorbed as an image. And that's it, right? There
Right.
isn't that much about experience. But even though the graphics are not quite there yet in some of the metaverse platforms, it's starting to be a bit more experiential, which to me is very architectural. You have to think about how do people enter, where do they go, what's the next step that they do, how does this not only how does it look from the outside, but how does it work on the inside, and how do you go through the space?
Yeah, I think there's a really interesting little conversation there, because I think that was one of my questions or thoughts. Is, on one hand, I'm excited as an architect. I've got this new world that we can go and play in, whether it's a game engine or the metaverse or whatever it is. But on the other hand, I was kind of worried that these next gen tools, which I see a lot of young students coming out, like I was at a conference with we were in a workshop, and there was a couple of students that just graduated, and I was just kind of asking them, oh, what did you do your project in, and all this kind of stuff. Like, do they teach you Rhino or Grasshopper or something? And they were like, no, we mostly just learn Houdini. And then they went out to go and try and find jobs, and no one was really, no one's using Houdini. And then they got into like advertising and like creating animations on Instagram and all this kind of stuff. So on
Mm.
one hand, it's creating new opportunities for architects, but on the other hand, are we going to create a brain drain where now like talented architects just become like Instagram influencers, or go and work, for like a metaverse company, or go and work for game engine companies because the salary is better and all this kind of stuff. So I'm trying to balance that. On one hand, I'm excited by the opportunities it creates for architects. On the other hand, I see young architects coming out and using these really cool and fun tools, but they're not super applicable right now to a architecture practice. And it's tricky to find that balance right between the two.
Yeah, definitely. And architecture is a very challenging profession that doesn't pay well. So you have to be a diehard fan, right, to stay into it, to really believe that architecture design makes a big difference. I think that's the only way to stay sane. Well, maybe there's a couple of routes, right? One is you've just been doing it for so much that it's too hard to change now, so you keep going at it,
Yeah,
but you're not particularly inspired. The other is okay, and I can speak from personal experience because every not so much anymore, but a few years back I used to have like a complete mental breakdown, right, and be like, what am I doing with my life? How am I going to support my family with architecture? And then I realized, why I'm doing it, which is to make a difference in the world because design definitely matters, right? So for those people that appreciate how design impacts our well-being, how it impacts our quality of life, how it impacts the cities that we occupy, how it impacts how we live, then I think no matter what they do, one way or another, they'll try to find a way back into architecture. But there are a lot of people that are not so interested about all those things, right? Maybe they're more interested in some other things, maybe pursuing the graphic side of things or pursuing the computational side of things and so on. So I don't I actually had similar feelings like you, but in a slightly different way about the metaverse and about all these digital technologies that they're, yes, maybe in a way similar. Essentially they're a distraction, right, from everything else that's happening that should be important, that what we think is important or what we have been taught or read about that's important in architecture. But when I started accepting that it's kind of here to stay, and then looking into it a little closer and uh, you know taking a chance and actually going and seeing what the fuss is all about inside of the central land and those kinds of things, and seeing that there is also an architecture opportunity in there, which especially younger architects don't think too much about, which is the experiential side of things.
Mm. Yeah, and I think it's a really great answer, and I think there's something really interesting in, you don't have to do one or the other. Like bouncing between those worlds by adopting technology, it allows you to, transition from a digital world. One week you're designing for a metaverse, the other week you're designing for a house or a, modular building system or something like that. Like I really think, and part of the reason why we started Archi-Tech Network was that the adoption of technology, I think, will allow us to adapt as architects. And also we have to adopt a little bit more on the entrepreneurship side. And I think taking opportunities in different areas as well as the built side allows us to kind of like transition and learn new things and bring that back to the real world. Some of the real world may influence the digital. And to me, I think that's where it gets kind of quite exciting, right? You're not a metaverse architect. You're not a physical, I don't know what you call it now, a real world architect. You're just an architect, and embracing technology and the opportunities is really what's going to make the next generation of architects.
Absolutely, 100% correct. And to illustrate that point even better, let's look at the history of Zaha, right? So Zaha Hadid, she did not practice architecture until, I don't know, I'm going to lie here, but maybe she was 40 or she was quite late. And Frank Gehry also. So these are people that spent a good chunk of their time thinking about what it means to design through different mediums. And their mediums, the way they explore their mediums, was very spatial in regards to of how they think about it. Maybe not everybody else thought about it in that respect, but they thought about it that way. So if we see where digital technology is going, you can think of it in the exact same manner, right? So if, let's say, if Zaha were to start today, would she be drawing her beautiful drawings today, or would she probably be doing something in 3 dimensions in, metaverse or just Unreal or something else, to explore those kinds of spatial design, spatial qualities that she was after?
Yeah, it's an interesting reference. I think, yeah, would they be using, because what's interesting about both Zaha and Gehry is they can only really create those buildings by adopting the technology. Is almost a means to actually realize their designs, which is a pursuit of space and what these spatial qualities might be like. But it never seems to be integrated into the actual design. It's a means to an end, rather than like it's not like the design is driven by a highly digital process. For example, it's very data driven, whether it's the environment or its form and function. They seem to kind of pursue an idea, and the only way to get there is through innovation on the digital side. I think there's something kind of interesting about that. If they were kind of to start today, it would be interesting. Would they gravitate to the digital side, or would they kind of go for that more hand drawing or sculpting, and then find the digital side through the act of making, if that makes sense? But it's an interesting example.
Yes, well, not sure about Zaha, right? It's one of those things that just look as if where the technology and the design thinking completely meet up at the right time to create,
Right.
the huge impact that we have in the practice today. Whereas on Frank Gehry, there's a really good article in the, I think it was in the can't remember, MIT or Harvard Business Review. That's where it is, and where he talks in a way where you don't see a lot of references about the way that they use technology. So from the get-go, he realized that in order to have his technology, his designs being built, you have to have a really good grasp on how they're built. And they started adopting their version of CATIA, or from the beginning of the practice. And in that article, it also mentions about the Disney concert hall, how in the first phase, they tried to build it, but they weren't, the client wasn't trustful enough of Frank Gehry, and they hired another
Yeah.
architect. And that architect said,
No way.
I can't build that. Then there was a bit of a hold. Frank Gehry showed that they can do it in Bilbao. Then one of the heiresses of Disney, they came back and they said, okay, you got full control of the thing. Just give it to us, right? And he did, on budget, on time. So it's a fantastic example. And I think a lot, including myself, when I was a young architect, I was kind of blocked off by the stylistic and the aesthetics of people like Frank Gehry and Zaha, because they have a very strong aesthetic reference. But if we look beyond that and look at what they're doing for the practice of architecture, them and maybe Calatrava are the biggest innovators at the moment, right? In how they're using technology to develop the profession further. And that's exactly what Frank Gehry has done, even though, the quality of some of his projects is quite debatable and subjective.
That's funny. I read the exact same article like a month ago as well. I think it was like floating around on LinkedIn or something, but really interesting article. Maybe I'll also put it in the link or something, because you're absolutely right. It's what you may not realize about Gehry is he's actually quite well known for delivering his products on time and on budget, which is super interesting. And the article, as you said, it kind of points to two things. One is kind of BIM and the digital side, like they model everything. And so when it gets to site, like they've already tested how these things go together and tried to like absorb problems on site on the digital side, which, I also have experience when I was working as a facade consultant with that problem. Like if you solve all these things digitally on site, is so much smoother. And also the other thing that as you mentioned, was the contractual setup. That they sit, or Gehry and partners sit directly under the client, and even the contractor sits under the architect, and that's how they can control the process. So super interesting article, right? And in fact, we're just releasing our Revit masterclass, and in my introduction, I put him down as one of the true stories of the real promise of BIM versus our current in practice version of BIM. So I think I'm really glad you brought that up, because it's a really great point, and I'll put the article in the link below, which also brings us to a little bit of the BIM world, right? I know you're not experimenting on the BIM side of Blender that much, but there does seem to be a rising interest in what's now being branded as Blender BIM, right? So BIM, again, my Blender has all these plugins, right, that you can, or packages, I'm not sure what the term is for it, but that you can quickly and pretty easily add to Blender. And one of them is kind of turns the model into, gives you all the functionality of BIM. Is that something you've played around or are interested in that much? Because definitely from an outside perspective, it seems to be, there's a little bit of interest. Some people are like, hey, have you checked out this Blender BIM thing?
Yeah, so I've definitely dabbled with it. In fact, I exported a few projects from Revit to IFC, which takes forever. And then I was absolutely stunned by the speed at which they open in Blender. And the reason for that being is that Blender BIM is kind of a cool name, but it's actually called IFC Open Shell. So what happens under the hood of Blender BIM is everything is actually IFC. Blender is just the interface, for interacting with IFC elements directly, right? So, and then it gives you an interface to tag different elements in different ways. So you can use it as Navisworks and bring in all kinds of different IFC models together to look for issues, for challenges, or see how everything is coming together. Or you can even do some native authoring. And that's where maybe Revit has the edge at the moment, and the other ArchiCAD and the other established practices, because they have a pretty good tool set for authoring architectural elements. A Blender BIM, it's a bit more manual in that respect, so you can model anything and tag it as anything you want as IFC. We're finally seeing with some of the latest versions of Revit that capability, which has existed for a long time in ArchiCAD and some other alternatives. But it's also there in Blender BIM. Now, for people that are just dabbling with design here and there, it might be a bit too challenging, right? It's like, okay, you have to go and you have to tag everything, because unlike Revit, if you draw a wall, Revit knows, okay, this is IFC wall, this is IFC door, IFC window, furniture, and so on. In Blender BIM, and to some extent, FreeCAD, which is another open source software which I have worked with, does it. You have to be really well organized to do it. And we all know, as architects, we get into these deadlines and these high pressure moments where we probably are not as well organized as we want to be, right? So then if you don't have a system as rigid as Revit is, or something of that sort, then it's like importing an AutoCAD file. There has been around a few consultants. It has more layers than numbers that you can count on your, gosh, too many. So in that respect, it's still developing, but there's a lot of enthusiasm in it, yes, for what it means. And Dion Mote, who's the main developer who started it, he works at Lend-Lease in Australia at their headquarters, and he proposed that solution to Lend-Lease, but not also Lend-Lease, because he doesn't want to be associated just with them, but with the fact of contractors, owners, having the data of their buildings not be tied to a specific suite. Because these days, you don't just deliver drawings and a ready building, right? Buildings are like submarines, right? They have engineering, they have all these. You need to have your blueprints in case something goes wrong. It helps also with controls for water, for all the utilities, electricity, and so on. So operators are using BIM models as well, and they're realizing, okay, we don't want to really be tied into a format that actually we have to pay to access, because that's our building, right? If you think about it, and I think about this quite a bit, it's absolutely absurd, right? When back, not so long ago, 20, 30 years ago, a bit longer, okay, we used to only draw by hand, right? And nobody owned your pencil. Okay, maybe your firm owned your pencil, but they wouldn't mind if you took it home. Nobody owned your sketch paper or vellum. That was what was there. So if you drew something on that piece of paper, there's no way somebody can come and say, "Yeah, wait a minute, you have to give me that, or you have to pay," right? Whereas now, with subscription-based packaging, especially with Autodesk, uh, you don't own your data unless you pay for it, right? We're renting our own data, which is crazy. So Blender BIM tries to solve a little bit of that problem. And not only the whole IFC workflows for being an agnostic format is trying to address some of these concerns about where the data lives. And I'm particularly excited about things like IFC.js, right? Which might also touch on some of the things that we talked previously about. So where is the profession going? On one hand, we have Unreal, we have the metaverse. And on the other hand, I think we have more BIM data, right? Which is highly structured, buildable in a way. Maybe not as pretty, right? So these are not like Zaha designs, but hugely accessible to any of the parties that are part of the building consortium.
That's a really interesting way to put it, especially like kind of you're you're paying, you're renting your own data. Is kind of a interesting analogy. Yeah, I think it's. I asked because we're in this era of BIM where, you know, likewise the tools we're working with are just, pretty antiquated and not developing, and it's not really delivering what I call like the true promise of BIM. And there's pieces of the puzzle out there. You've got Blender BIM, I think, is a great example of open source software. As you said, it's free and accessible, so you own the things that you create and the data you create. You've got like other in our very in our podcast. One before this was we had Harvard from Reub, who we were talking about this exact thing. There's things like Hyper, where you've got like this BIM platform that's cloud based. You've got all these kind of computation and AI plugins that are kind of tying into it. All of the pieces are there, and it seems like some kind of game engine will be the environment where we put all these pieces together. And
Yeah.
Blender could be a really good candidate for that, or Unreal, or who knows. So I think Blender BIM is a really interesting piece of that puzzle of what's going to be the future. Who knows? It could end up becoming the future of BIM. But obviously, being also a BIM guy, I had to ask you about the hype behind Blender BIM. But it's exciting. I'm definitely going to jump into it. I think, as always, like with these podcasts, we want to kind of communicate to particularly other architects and younger architects and students the tools and technologies we actually use as architects. And you are using Blender on a day-to-day basis. Would you recommend this to a student to learn in as a modeling platform, or would you recommend it with a combination of learning Rhino and Grasshopper and Blender together?
Oh, I would not recommend it at all. Why? Who would, in their right mind, try to pick up a free software that can do everything for you? No, I'm kidding. Of course, I super highly recommend Blender because it is quite universal. And at the moment, I'm updating my Blender architecture masterclass, which is aimed for more, let's say, everyday architecture instead of more sleek architecture, more organic, fluid forms. And it has a strong place in that respect as well, right? And there's some workflows. For me, it's the best of both worlds in a way, right? So Rhino, it's something that you can't live without. I can't live without, right? So it's very important. But modeling something that you think would look good takes time because of the way that Rhino works, right? You start with a line, you draw another line, and then you loft them. Then you intersect, one surface with another surface to get what you need. So, and none of that is non-destructive, right? Of course, you can do it with Grasshopper, and you spend maybe a lot of time developing one script for Grasshopper, and then your boss, your manager, or your client says, "Oh, but how about we do this?" And you're like, "Oh gosh, I have to start all over again,"
Yeah,
right?
that doesn't work in the logic I've created.
Exactly. So it is great. Like I love these tools, right? I mean, I use Grasshopper as long as I've used Blender, right? And I feel like I'm quite proficient at it. But these days I'm using it less and less, unless it's for some kind of level of detail that's required to have that level of precision. Yeah. For early design stages where you want to be a bit more loose, you want to be a bit more explorative, try not one or two ideas and spend a long time on just those ideas, but try 5 or 6 or 10 ideas and be a little bit loose. It's like sketching. For me, using Blender is like 3D sketching, right? And not like sculpting or anything like that, but really having like digital form that's really easy to move around and come together with for a level of idea, of being able to explore that idea a bit more. So definitely, I think it's probably the best thing that students can do at the moment is pick up Blender because it's so highly useful and for being able to express your own creativity.
It's really interesting that you also said it's kind of like sketching, because uh, I also get that same comment from the Maya world, also Houdini. Like, it's just, I guess, playing and experimenting with form and sketching is a lot easier in these kind of more animation based software. So I think that's a really interesting kind of point. It's a great conceptual sketching in 3D essentially,
Yeah.
which is great. And of course, I was going to say, where's the best place to learn? Well, I guess they can go and check out your YouTube channel as a good starting point.
Yes.
And you also have a masterclass. Do you want to let the audience know where can they go and find your masterclass? And do you have any ones that are coming up at the moment?
Right. So for you can find all the information at uhstudio.com. And in there's a little link for Academy, which is part of UH Studio Academy. And that's my platform, which is started really as a response to uh, being able to teach more people about Blender. I was realizing that I was having a bit of impact in the practices that I was working, but I wanted to have a larger impact because this tool is too good to not be used. So
I like it.
there you can find my YouTube channel on there, which is again UH Studio Design Academy, and in there you can also find a link to all the different kinds of courses. So at the moment, I'm working for an upgrade of my architecture masterclass. I was waiting for geometry nodes to mature a little bit, which is the newest tool. Again, it's a bit like Houdini, and it allows you to fairly quickly instance geometry or slightly modify things. It's not very good at modification. You can't expect like really precise offsets and things, but it's really good at instancing thousands and thousands of pieces. And in the way that it's put together as like just another modifier, the the data from geometry nodes is easily reusable, perhaps a bit more so than the way the Grasshopper has been developed.
Mm.
So I was waiting for that to mature to be able to create that. And by the time this will be published, will already have had my parametric architecture weekend intensive course. But you would probably be able to check out the recording of it if anybody's interested on PA Academy. And yeah, so I'm trying to cater for different, let's say, tastes, right? So on one hand, we have um, the Maya people, right, which I feel very comfortable with in that regards, in that type of subdivision based modeling. On the other hand, we have just pattern based, tessellation based, floor based, a lot of these other types of modelings, which are just as relevant and maybe more relevant than fluid organic modeling.
Right. I'll put all your links to YouTube and your course in the description below, so people can go and check it out, because I think you've got a great series of courses lined up. I'm even one of your students, but I'm probably one of your worst students because I haven't completed the course yet. But it's on my list of things to get through, because I'm, like I said, I'm really interested in, out of all this next gen stuff, I think Unreal excites me and Blender excites me. So that's going to be the new things I'm going to add to my skill set. Maybe just to kind of uh, end the podcast on our reoccurring question, which I've been asking a lot of guests, because we're in this super interesting era with all these different things coming up, all these next gen tools. You're obviously already immersed in that: Unreal, Unity, Blender, but we've also got game engines, other game engines. We've got AI coming in and all this image creation stuff, and it's almost on a weekly basis. Is there anything on the horizon that you see right now that really excites you about the future of architecture, obviously outside of Blender?
Yeah, definitely. And it's AI, but not in the way that we're seeing it just yet. I think BricsCat might be the company that's doing the closest to what I have in mind. And what I have in mind is essentially being able to turn a concept architecture model into a BIM model in the easiest fashion possible. Because that translation method of translation, unless you're doing it in digital project or CATIA, it takes probably the most amount of resources
Really?
for many companies. So having an easy way to translate that information, from that concept sketch that we were talking about, just really quickly modeling a few things and having the AI know, okay, this is kind of vertical, that must be a wall, right? This there kind of looks like a column, so I'll tag that as a column. That's a hole in the wall. Does it go to the ground? Yes. That's a door. Does it not go to the ground? Then that's a window. So all these kinds of things. I'm hoping that becomes the next level of AI, because right now I see AI as a fantastic tool. I use Midjourney and all those kinds of platforms all the time. They're great for inspiration, for initial inspiration, but at the moment there's no real way to incorporate those into developing an existing project a bit further.
Yeah. Yeah, what was the company called that you mentioned at the beginning? BrickCAD?
BricsCAD, yeah. So they do
Bricks.
their own CAD-based software. It looks a little bit like a AutoCAD clone,
Mm-hmm.
but they've added some additional features to it. And I have tried it before, so it does do BIM. It says that it can automatically classify things, so you kind of use it like SketchUp. You extrude, you move, and you put things in there, and then you click a button, and it thinks, okay, that's a wall. Fine, we'll make that a wall. But for my use, it's maybe a bit too much like SketchUp, in the sense that, okay, if you know how groups work in Revit, right? Where you're not just doing one individual element, but you kind of unitizing things and using modules as much as possible. I also want to have that kind of intelligence into the system that I'm using.
Interesting. Yeah, I think that's also a really good example. I'm kind of on board as well with. I'm super excited about Midjourney and we're using it, but it's really just the tip of the iceberg of what's on the horizon and what's coming. And there's something really interesting about automating those things that we spend a lot of time doing. Like, I should be able to just draw a stairs and it's code compliant if I'm in, XYZ country. So there's something quite interesting about not the conceptual end, but actually the technical side, and can we automate the contextual side, the tech side with AI and automate that? So I think that could be a really interesting development. I keep bringing up like Mr. Clippy of Revit that will just do all this stuff for you, right?
I'm sure, if Autodesk wants to stay in the game, they will have to develop that kind of technology.
Yeah. Well, that's great. I think we'll maybe end it here because we're just getting onto some things. I want to save it because we'll have you on in the future when hopefully I know a bit more about Blender at this point, and then I'm sure you've got lots of cool new things that we can discuss. But we've touched on it a little bit already. But is there anything that you want to let the audience know that's coming up? Any courses? I know you got your parametric architecture one this weekend, but by the time this is out, it'll be probably gone. But they can maybe go and access the recordings, right?
I think so, yeah. So if you go to UH Studio and then you check out Academy, that you can see all the upcoming courses that are available there. And yes, I'm working very hard at the moment at an update for my master class, after which I'll probably spend a bit of time creating a course on using geometry nodes, because I think that's a really fascinating new tool that, again, could aid architecture design quite a bit. And I want to say thanks for having me. And I'm also looking forward to your feedback from the course. See what you think of it. What can get improved? What's useful? And how can we make that into a BIM model?
For sure, for sure. I know I'm going to delve into it, and thank you for all the effort for putting your courses out. Like I know very well, I'm literally going through wrapping up our Revit masterclass. We've got a Rhino Inside one after that. It's a lot of effort, and so I know the effort that goes into it. So thank you for all the content that you're putting out there, because I think it's really helping to drive this particular part of our industry. So everyone in the audience, I'll put all the links there. Go and check it out now. get started with your Blender skill set, because it's a great program and it's totally free to get started, which is the most important thing.
Cool, great. Thanks again, and speak soon.
Thanks for having me. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with another episode. I think we're going to get someone in to talk a little bit about some other kind of software that we've been playing around with. But stay tuned, and thank you again for joining us. And hopefully we'll have you on again soon in the future.
My pleasure.
Cheers.
Cheers.